So my name is Leah Stavenhagen, and I'm going to be doing my TED Talk today on translating trauma. And I'll do this by exploring both how and why it is done. But before beginning my discussion, I'm going to read an excerpt from a piece that we all read about 2 months ago from Svetlana Broz's Good People in an Evil Time. The passage from the story that I will read was recounted to Broz by an older Croatian woman and tells of her experience when a Serbian official barged into her apartment. It begins with dialogue. "What do you want with me? Can't you see that I could be your great-grandmother?" I pleaded with him. "Shut up." He sat on the chair and unbuttoned his pants. I wept and pleaded with him, asking him to spare me, but nothing helped. He abused me sexually in all imaginable ways. If he'd cut me to pieces, I think it would have been easier to bear. He was not drunk. He left at 2 o'clock in the morning. These blunt words are difficult to read because of how apparent the emotion and distress this event caused for the woman is. The audience is instantly struck by what has been recounted, no matter how different their lives may be, for they too, male or female, can find a way to identify and relate to this account. It strikes sympathetic chords because one can envision how a slight situational change could have ended them or someone dear to them in a similar circumstance. So how does one effectively translate trauma when they have presumably not had the same experiences as the original author, and even if they had, their perspectives would inevitably be much different on them? Trauma is defined as something that overwhelms narrative and cannot be completely understood by an individual, for it provides a lasting impression, especially on the subconscious mind. If this is the nature of trauma, then the idea of storying traumatic events becomes innately impossible, for one cannot relay an experience if they can't find the words to describe how their feelings and emotions were affected by the situation that unfolded. One could look towards other ways of conveying messages, such as images and their service to films and graphic novels. The pictorial aspect of these alternative modes of communication could arguably be considered more effective at elucidating traumatic events. Images have the power to express emotions that are universal and sometimes inexpressible with words, so their presence helps to illustrate trauma even when it isn't quite understood. I'd like to take a moment to consider an example from Marjane Satrapi's autobiographical graphic novel, Persepolis. Her novel is a narrative of girlhood in Iran in the midst of civil unrest. By choosing to use both images and words in her work, Satrapi effectively portrays certain emotions that would otherwise be ignored. In this frame from her novel, we see Ahmadi, a member of the guerrillas, being tortured by the government. These brutal images are contrasted with those of the protagonist, Marjane, at the bottom, while she watches her mother iron. On the far right, the text reads, "I never imagined that you could use that appliance for torture." Here, the combination of images and words allows for the reader to quickly grasp the situation and how present and defining war was to her childhood. At other parts in the novel, there are moments when the picture shown juxtaposes the words that accompany it. It is impossible to measure if words would have been able to effectively transmit the same messages, but the disparities seen between certain images and words actively portray feelings, like fear and sarcasm, which could otherwise be inexpressible. We can compare Satrapi's graphic novel to Broz's work or Rigoberto Menchu's. I have already mentioned the compilation of accounts from the Bosnian crisis that Svetlana Broz put together earlier this semester we studied parts of Rigoberto Menchu's testimony of the plight of the indigenous Guatemalans during and after the Civil War. All three authors' writings are profusions of traumatic events, but they go about this differently. Persepolis is told as a story of growing up, while the latter two are testimonies that more overtly utilize the perspective of an adult. These authors have chosen to share their traumatic events with the public, so the reader must keep this in mind when approaching them. We see this warning most clearly with Rigoberto Menchu's creation due to the scandal that developed over its authenticity. There are definitely political components to their work. Satrapi used her novel to educate the West in Iran, Menchu to highlight realities in Guatemala, and Broz to showcase instances of good in Bosnia in a time marked by crisis and devastation. Moreover, there is a cathartic element because psychologists have learned that sharing events and memories can be one of the most effective methods to overcome trauma. In an article I read that considers both Persepolis and I, Rigoberto Menchu, the author writes, "They do not ask for analysis of the political crises about which they testify. Instead, they use a range of strategies, especially around sympathy, to create authoritative and gendered critiques for diverse audiences." This quotation underscores how these authors effectively communicate their political messages to faraway cultures. Language is a vehicle that permits us to work cooperatively, but today, with the presence of about 7,000 different languages, it also presents a barrier that separates different identities and cultures and consequently slows communication and progress. In an increasingly global world, we are compelled to translate these testimonies of trauma because we see the necessity in learning from each other to gain deeper understanding and appreciation. I've explored some of the difficulties and complexities associated with relaying traumatic experience. If these events are considered to overwhelm narrative, then does translating them not become a futile pursuit? In short, yes. Nothing can ever be translated exactly, and with trauma, there are added intricacies. But without translation, the accessibility of these accounts would be quite limited. These authors have intended for their works to be shared, so they are already somewhat designed for translation. One way this is done is through personalization. The aforementioned article considered that it seems as if a personal story is the best and worst way to communicate across differences. By adding an individualized component, the authors actively give their readers something to identify with. They personalize history and crisis, but simultaneously reduce some of the larger complexities of the whole situation. Beginning to explore the translation of trauma in depth, I originally thought, how could I, someone so removed from particular experiences, even begin to try and relay them to another? Like I would be inadequate in doing so, and my attempt might even be disrespectful to those who had actually endured such trauma. There's a certain part of me that firmly believes this. I have not experienced the horrors of life in Bosnia during the 90s, so how could I begin to write in a manner that would make it seem as if I was present? But at the same time, there's a way humans identify with one another which adds a universal aspect to any experience or account. Maybe you have not experienced rape, but you could picture yourself or a family member or a friend as the victim of a violent crime, and it all suddenly becomes more real. Reading the passage from Brose's piece is difficult because her words underscore how horrific this experience was for the reader and allows the audience to emotionally relate to it. There is a random, intuitive nature to the way that we relate to experiences and even events that we witness. It is something that we cannot predict or anticipate. Ellen Elias-Burzak comments on this when she discusses her work at the War Crimes Tribunal, saying, "I was surprised by it was that moved and upset me. As anyone who deals professionally with disturbing documents or testimonies will know, identification is a strange and unpredictable business." To conclude, translating trauma has many intricacies, but these should not make one believe that it should not be done. Humans instinctively look for ways to identify with everything that they see, hear, or do, and many of these associations have a random component. Adding images may enhance the ability for an author to relay traumatic experience, particularly when trying to translate across languages due to the additional media through which they have to communicate. Fortunately, many of us have not had to endure most traumatic experiences, so in order for us to understand those that we are presented, we rely on our imaginations and the associations that we can make. Thank you.
Questions?
Yeah.
Had you already read that graphic novel, or when did you?
Yeah, I'd already read it. I was kind of reading it at the same time for another class, and it got me thinking about it.
Well, I was just going to say, I thought it was really interesting to tie in Satrapi's visual novel, just because that is told from the perspective of a child, and they tend to internalize trauma very differently than adults do. So I thought that was a really interesting reference that you told in there, because that's a very different perspective on trauma and also that she used graphics along with the actual text.
Yeah, and I think it's also interesting because we're receiving it through a child, so that makes it a little bit easier for us to relate, but at the same time, it's Satrapi's writing it as an adult, so then there's that additional form that has to go through.